Nobody likes to swatch their paints. We just want to grab our paint and start creating something. Now, the thing is, I've got such a problem because if you've watched my video on decluttering, you see that I own too much paints. And this is where I realized that my palette is so limited to a couple of colors. And you can see I've got my swatch card here with my existing palette and what exactly I have. And at the same time, I'm not using so many of these colors that I have in my palette or I have in my box. So this project of wanting to swatch my colors was really a personal one of mine, and also for me to discover the various colors, how they look like on the paper that I use most. So here you can see that I've got my 100% Arch paper that I use the most, and this is where I've created little boxes to help me to swatch all my paints. Now, the lines and what you decide to have on your swatch cards is really up to you. And these were elements and properties that I wanted to monitor in the paints that I own, and this is why I have selected or created the boxes in this way. After I pencil in the lines, I used a waterproof archival pen to help me to draw lines over, because you're going to be using water and paint, so you don't want your marker to be one that's going to blend and smudge into your swatch cards. Then I started to draw out my lines, and really this cards, the hardest part was probably trying to map out how much space each swatch card should be and how to maximize my watercolor paper. But beyond that, after that, it was pretty easy to work on. I would encourage you to stay to the end because I'm going to be showing you a whole bunch of colors in my palette that I must have. Another challenge I had was also figuring out how I was going to lay out the boxes. So you can see that I've got some boxes that are horizontal, and that's where the names of the tubes are going to be, and then I've got some lines that are vertical underneath, and this is where I struggled with figuring out what information I want within each column. And this year I'm using an acrylic marker to help me to do that one darker line, and that darker line is basically testing the transparency of my paints. So I'm going back in after I've cut them, and then I'm basically kind of coloring in that line with this acrylic marker. Our cards are nice and ready. The next thing left to do is to paint. So I started off by writing down all of the names of the paints first, so that I know that each of these paint tubes have a place, and then following which the next issue that I faced was figuring out if I had to squeeze out all of my paints on palettes. And this is where I realized that I could just squeeze out a really small tiny amount, a small dab on each paper, and then I would just spread out the paint using a little bit of water on my brush. And you can see that I'm just spreading out that paint on one side, and this side is going to be the side where it just is the color that is directly from the tube as an even wash. And then I'm spreading it over to the other side, where at this point I'm really trying to test how the paint moves when it interacts with water. So I've washed off my paint from my brush, and then I've kind of gone in with some clear water, and you can see that the paint is moving towards the bottom. I was testing how exactly each paint tube moves and reacts to water, And it was very fun to see because some paints move rapidly across the water the moment it's touched, and there were some paints that were slower to move. This was extremely fun to see just because I used to think that if I wanted movement in some of my paintings, I would only or mostly use liquid watercolor, but I could also see that there were some colors and brands that actually moved or exploded a lot in water, and this is where taking down some of these notes about the way in which the paint reacted to water definitely helps me to learn about the pigments that I own, and it also taught me that depending on how heavy each pigment grain is, it would also influence how it moves on water. So if you've got pigments that are granulating, for example, they tend to be heavier and bigger in terms of sizes. So as a result, they might not move as rapidly as paints that are less granulating. And this is also the same for opaque paints. So these were some of the observations that I made as I was learning about my swatches. You would notice that I'm using a flat brush, and I find that it's so much easier to use a flat brush in this swatch card project because I feel like I will be able to get that precision where I wanted the colors to not flow from one side of the swatch card to the next. Over time, I developed a system where I would lay out my cards and match them with the names of the tube paints so that I know I can just squeeze them out and go along the way. This project literally took me about a month to do, but I also told myself that it was my own personal undertaking and I really wanted to just take my time. There were days where I would just swatch maybe 2 or 3 colors at one go. And even though the progress was really slow, I also told myself that I got to appreciate each color more and more. And at the same time, I also started to pay attention to how certain pigment names, like for example PY or PG or PB, and all of these pigment names had certain characteristics, and I could also see how they were different across various manufacturers. And this also made me learn not just about the colors but also appreciate the collection that I was growing. My collection of tube paints are extremely expensive, and what I mean by that is that you don't have to expand to this level or to have this many tube paints for you to start painting, but the amount of paints that I had made me feel like I was not utilizing them to their maximum capacity. So these swatch cards gave me an opportunity to not just learn about them, but also force me to rethink my color palette. So that's going to be a video for another time because I'm planning to reshuffle my color palette for this year. And I will also be showing you a whole bunch of paints that I really love having in my palette. So stay tuned to the end because we're going to be showing you that. And I would encourage you to start with a much smaller collection. And of course, it also depends on your budget and accessibility because so many of the time it's not accessible in many places as well. I learned that after I've gathered all similar hues together, pigments which had the same pigment formulation like PY65, PY65, that they had the same kind of formulation, but they could come in different names depending on the brand. And at the same time, it could also appear different on your paper. So this means that we can't really buy pigments of the same name and expect that even though they are from different brands and you already own one of this color, that it's going to look the same on your paper. Because if you think about it, it's a little bit like going to the supermarket and buying pasta sauce. So even though it's the same name like bolognese, it could also still be a different recipe because it's a different kitchen and all of that. So similarly, when I was testing out paints, even though I've got two brands that are different that have the same name, lemon yellow, they ended up looking different on paper. When I was done swatching all of my cards, I left them all to dry, and some of them have been drying for months because I have not picked them up. And like I said, I've embarked on this project for the last month or so. And what I'm doing is I picked up a scrubber brush, which is what you're seeing me use right now, and I'm going to be listing it in the description below. So this scrubber brush is made up of harder bristles, and the nice thing is that you are able to lift off paint from these swatch cards. So you can see that I'm slowly scrubbing over my scrubber brush onto these swatch cards, and my scrubber brush is damp right now, so this allows me to kind of lift off the paint. And this is actually doing a stain test. Now the stain test kind of gives us a sense of whether or not your paint is able to lift off, and this is great especially when you want to create highlights in your painting. If you stayed till the end, thank you so much. And as a treat, let me share with you some of these beautiful colors that I love to have in my palette, whether it's for mixing or to have in my paintings. Share with me what are some of the colors that you cannot live without in your palette. I'd love to hear from you, so let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if this is something that you really enjoyed watching. And until then, I'll see you again next week.